I'm not sure the SNP are winning out of this just yet, Andy. But I think the way I would characterise it is, if you take this precise time last week, are the SNP stronger or weaker as a result? And I think I would argue that they're stronger. They've got a potential for a stronger platform. Now, that's just potential. That has to be realised now by the candidates, if there are candidates in this contest. But I do think that the point being that they're in a stronger position now than they were last.
I think that it gets us into really interesting territory, because what we have at the moment, we have no confirmed candidates, incidentally. I think it's probably worth mentioning that. But I think what we do have at the moment is would be completely fair to term John Swinney as a front runner at this point. Okay. I think that's reasonable to do. But that clearly Kate Forbes is a contender as well. Now, I think there are three reasons as a front runner, as John Swinney is, why he would be extremely wise to be trying to get Kate Forbes on his side. And a lot of them are contained within that poll, which is why it's relevant here. Firstly, the only person, I think, who could conceivably beat John Swinney in a leadership election, he'd be the favourite, don't get me wrong, but the only person who could conceivably actually beat him amongst the party membership is Kate Forbes, because she's very popular, and she proved that last year by coming close to beating Humza Yousaf, against all odds, really, at that point, given how her campaign had gone. So if you want to be First Minister and you're the front runner, you don't want the person who's potentially the other contender to run. You want to keep them out of the race. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is that party unity is an important factor here. I noticed the other day that Stephen Noon, friend of our podcast who's been on before, who supported Kate Forbes last year because he felt that change was what was needed, is actually supporting John Swinney this time because he thinks that what's needed now is unity, more so than change. So again, if you want party unity and you know the lines along which this party is split, then you get the other person in on board. And thirdly, and this is really important because I think it's easy for the SNP to slip into an impression that this is just about who's in charge and everything will be better when somebody else is in charge, but it's not. There are policy problems here. There are priority problems here. And actually, she is the person in the country, as that poll shows, that most of the country thinks can solve the problems, even if not most of the party thinks that she can solve the problems. All of that leads for me to a pretty easy choice for John Swinney. I don't think this is a difficult situation for John Swinney at all. I think the incredibly obvious thing for John Swinney to do is to give Kate Forbes absolutely everything she could possibly want to get her in with you, to get her in as your number two. That would make a pretty formidable team, and a team that Anas Sarwar would not want to take on as much as he was relishing taking on Humza Yousaf. I can tell you that. I don't know whether it'll happen, but, you know, smart people usually do smart things, and from the outside looking in, it's a perfectly obvious thing that he should be doing at this point.
Yeah, I'm just going to say thank you, Andy, for echoing the point that I made in the last podcast. No, I mean, but that's exactly what I said. I said that, you know, there's a general election upcoming, and I like to see party leadership contests. I think it's important that the members get their view, get their say. But there is an argument in this context to maybe have John Swinney, if that's what happens, and then say, look, all right, Kate, what do you want? Kind of thing. Let's bring this thing together and give ourselves the best chance at that election and not have a drawn-out contest. So I do see the argument. It's quite compelling in that context for those reasons. I think one other point I would make, semi-echoing what Andy has said, is Anas Sarwar and Craig Hoy on the last podcast were quite dismissive. Of course they have to be in political terms. But let's be absolutely clear. They were all quite happy for Humza to limp on as they saw it and take advantage of the polls in the general election. If you do get a John Swinney Kate Forbes ticket, that will be causing them to reassess and think, okay, we've got a challenge on our hands now. Because one other thing that's worth remembering is that the polls still have, yesterday, the SNP narrowly ahead. After everything that's gone on in the last week or two, the SNP are still ahead. Now, the Labour will still take seats in that context, don't get me wrong, but that's got to be a bit of cause of concern if you're Anas Sarwar just now.
I think that's right. And I think, you know, when we're caught up in the sort of 4 or 5 days that we've had, there is an automatic assumption that this is great for the opposition and bad for the government, right? Really good for Labour and really bad for the SNP. But look at the situation this time 1 week ago, and look at what we think might be the situation in, say, the middle of June. Who's winning out of this? Well, I would argue there's a pretty good argument to say the SNP's winning out of this situation and not anybody else. So yeah, they're going through short-term turmoil, bad headlines, all of that sort of thing. They might go into leadership contests, which is always difficult, even if the two candidates like each other and are friendly. You always have problems, because that's just the way it goes. But if you get to the point where, you've got that sort of situation where it's John Swinney and Kate Forbes at the top, who are the winners and who are the losers out of what's happening right now? Well, it's not as simple as what you would think.
Yeah, I would just follow up very briefly to say I'm not sure the SNP are winning out of this just yet, Andy. But I think the way I would characterise it is, if you take this precise time last week, are the SNP stronger or weaker as a result? And I think I would argue that they're stronger. They've got a potential for a stronger platform. Now, that's just potential. That has to be realised now by the candidates, if there are candidates in this contest. But I do think that the point being that they're in a stronger position now than they were last.
That is the danger, though. Sorry, I know we're spending a lot of time on this particular question.
No, it's good.
That is, I think, a big danger, and I see it slipping in to some of the comments that other cabinet ministers are making and some of what is going around in the media, is that there is almost an instinctive default position of saying, how do we get to a position where we can once again rely on the Green Party to help us in Parliament? It's creeping back in. That would be a massive, massive error, because that is exactly why they're in this difficulty now. That would be a huge mistake to get back into that. And that's where I'm interested in John Swinney's thought process on all of this, because he can't, as Anas Sarwar quite fairly said on our podcast on Monday, he can't hide from the fact that he's been central to all of this, and he was very central to the deal with the Greens, not only in constructing it, but in holding it together. He's got to show people, I think, that he understands that was wrong, and that he's going to move in a different direction. If he thinks it's more of the same, well, as the old saying goes, continuity won't cut it.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.